Clicker. We are talking about Islam. I'm just going to kind of back up and go to where we are and add some things as we go. Some things we talked about, a few questions along the way. As we said, the word itself means submission to the will of Allah. And they're called Muslims because Muslim means one who submits. So those two words, as you can see, are related. SLM being the root, which we also said is the root for shalom or peace. Speaking of where this is, we talked about having a map last week. So here's my map. I know if you're in the room, you might can see it poorly. If you have it at home, you should have gotten an email with the picture. So Saudi Arabia is the yellow, and Mecca and Medina are both here on the Red Sea side. To give you an idea, you can see up here, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, and then Yemen, Oman, and the UAE, and Qatar over here. So that peninsula, that Arabian Peninsula, it's about 200 miles between Mecca and Medina for the record. Mecca being the place that I believe Muhammad was born, Medina being the place where he's buried. Because of persecution that arose against him in Mecca. Mecca is still the holiest city of Islam. When we talk about some of the practices, namely the Hajj pilgrimage, it's to Mecca, although many pilgrims do go to Medina as well. It's a popular place because of the holiest mosque is in Mecca, the second holiest is in Medina, and the third holiest is in Jerusalem. And it's this bad boy right here. Not that one, but this one. Everybody thinks the Dome of the Rock, the Golden Dome, is the most holy. It's not. It is actually this other mosque on the same site on the Temple Mount that is the third holiest mosque. So three key cities there. This picture of Jerusalem we looked at last week and talked about the overlap and then the differences between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, because one of the things they share, those are the three great monotheistic religions. Most of the other religions we're going to talk about are polytheistic or atheistic, but these three are monotheistic in addition to sharing history. I think some of you were surprised last week when we talked about how Muslims view Jesus, and it's favorably, though not as the divine Son of God. For them, their God is Allah. Allah is simply the Arabic word for God. In the Hebrew, which we talk about Judaism, there are several names for God, Yahweh being the holiest, the covenant name. Allah is the only name you will hear a Muslim ever call God. That is his name. And while Muhammad is not God, you can't really talk about Islam without Muhammad playing his life and his influence, having an outsized influence in it. So we talked about those three things under ultimate concern, or who is the deity of this religion. Our second category are the sacred writings. Everybody knows the Quran. This is the one that is most closely associated with Islam, but there are two other things, and actually one is a writing. The hadith is a writing. The sunnah is more an oral tradition, though now you can find it written down. Much like Judaism, the holy book is shorter than the traditions that grew around it. The Quran is 114 chapters, about 6,000 verses. I should have compared that to the Bible. The Bible is bigger, for the record. But nonetheless, the Quran is the size of the book. The hadith, to give you an idea if you weren't here, these two are focused on Muhammad. So when we talk about ultimate concern, Muhammad being key, even though they're not worshiping Muhammad, two of their holiest texts or writings or I don't know, traditions specifically have to do with who Muhammad was. Namely, this is the stories about him, the traditions and stories that grew up about him. And the Sunnah are the oral traditions of how he lived. So this becomes the example to any good Muslim. One of the questions that was asked last week, when we get into the five pillars, the practices, was about prayer. I don't remember who asked the question, but the question was, what kind of prayers do they pray? And is there a model prayer like the Lord's Prayer? So the prayers of good Muslims are mostly traditional or recitations. 5 times a day, which we'll talk about, remind each other in a minute, are the times they do it. But when they pray, it's not like extemporaneous prayer. It is memorized or traditional prayer, certain ones, certain times of day. And in the Sunnah, the traditions of Muhammad, there's not really a Lord's Prayer, a Muhammad prayer, but there is a very specific description about how Muhammad prayed certain prayers. And it's a pretty long one. Like he would start by standing, he would hold his hands a certain way, he would sit at times, he would cross his arms. And so there's a very lengthy tradition that comes out of this about how he would pray. It's not like the Lord's Prayer, which we can memorize and do, although many good Muslims would practice praying using the mannerisms and the technique of Muhammad, though the words aren't any different than some of the other prayers. So does that answer that question? I hope. I don't remember who asked it, so hopefully that makes sense. Then we spent lastly some time talking about the 5 pillars of Islam. These are the 5 ritual acts that all good Muslims do. The entry-level act and the repetition is this profession of faith. There is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. You say it 3 times with sincerity and passion to a practicer of Islam, and you're in. That's how you get in. And then that proclamation, profession is consistent. We've already mentioned that prayer is one of the ritual acts, 5 times a day prescribed. Always facing Mecca, very important that you face the right. And maybe more specifically, you're going to be facing the Kaaba, not just Mecca, that box that's in the center of the mosque in Mecca. Almsgiving or zakat, not a surprise, a religious place would do. In fact, in the Quran, and we'll talk about this. If I were to talk about Islam, many people point to it and often are quoted the points of the Quran about death to infidels of some sort that the good Muslim tries to find and eradicate the infidels. Most every place that is said, the very next verse says they aren't killed if they make a donation or if they practice zakat. If they give as allegiance to Allah, they can live. So
I could buy my way out of it. Huh?
I don't know if it's exactly meant that way, but there is a connection between some of those passages that are often cited as the more militant, or I don't know, it's homicidal tendencies that seem to be in the Quran are often followed by. But if the person shows whatever fealty by giving of alms, then so almsgiving, very important part. It'll apparently save your life. So everybody should give it.
Was that on a daily basis, or could that be?
That would be like
once in a lifetime.
I would think the idea is you've given the alms to spare your life, and as a pledge that you will continue. You are no longer an infidel, and an act that shows you're not an infidel is the giving of alms.
I guess that's the first time I've heard that part of this ritual act.
Well, I know it's a surprise, not really, because people do this with the Bible. You can grab a verse out of the Bible and make it say some things that really it never meant to say. And the same thing happens with other religious books.
Sure.
It's often when you read the full context that you see there might not be quite as harsh as you think, because you could pull Old Testament stuff out of the Hebrew Bible and say God desires that you kill every man, woman, child, beast in the territory when you go to war. That's not what God desires. So it's a very specific circumstance that's really harsh to think about, but that's not God's desire that we do that. So nonetheless, I guess all religions are prone to having misinterpretations for them. Number 4, fasting, the month of Ramadan. I don't know how to say that word. Swami, we say, I see Swami, but I know there's no I. So it's probably some form of that. I'm not good with Arabic. Never learned that. It's a very complicated, even though, Hebrew is a complicated language and they're technically related. Arabic is much more difficult, particularly from a written point of view. But we know about Ramadan. And then we talked a lot about the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Kaaba, which is this box that's in the middle of the mosque. in Mecca is really the key, and particularly this, the southeast corner, we talked about the black stone. It is inside this metal, I don't know, it's not really an oculus, this metal container. That is the black stone on the southeast corner. You can see roughly by the size of this person that it's probably 5 to 6 feet in the air, about head height. And on pilgrimage to Mecca, as you go around in circles, you hope to get close enough to the Kaaba to kiss this stone. There's also a golden door of some kind here, and you see a lot of people, like they're trying to do a pull-up into that. In fact, I found a video of Hajj. This was a few years back. Almost 2 million people went.
Can I interrupt for a second? I got a question. How long has that stone been there that they even walk on?
A long time.
All right, I'll buy it.
Since Muhammad's.
So it's been a long,
So it's right here, by the way. This is the black stone, and you see the people trying to press in.
Yeah.
If you get to touch it or kiss it, that's the highlight. It's right.
Now, isn't that the stone that Muhammad exited the earth to go to heaven?
No, that is not.
That's not. That's a different stone.
That's the stone that's in the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem.
Oh, okay.
Golden.
Okay.
And he didn't ascend permanently. It's this magic visitation to heaven.
Okay.
So you can see they just keep walking around. This is the stone is here. And then I don't know what this is. I couldn't find anything out about why they're trying to climb up or whatever on to that golden part of the Kaaba, but you can see quite the fight happens right there. That's another thing that happens on Hajj. It's one of the last things that the pilgrims will do. This isn't really inside the mosque. It's kind of just outside the mosque. This is called the stoning of the devil. So as they leave toward the end of their Hajj, there's this wall, and you can see the nice little bowl and all these people. The idea is to find 7 stones and to throw 7 stones at this wall, symbolic of when the devil tempted Abraham to not sacrifice Ishmael. This is the tradition. And you remember that was supposedly going to happen in Mecca, as connected to the Kaaba and some other things in the city, that the devil appeared to Abraham 3 times to try to convince him not to sacrifice Ishmael. And each time Abraham picked up rocks and threw them at the devil. And after throwing a total of 7 rocks on the 3rd time, the devil disappeared and never came back. And so part of what they do after they've made their pilgrimage and as they go into kind of like the celebration, I forget the name of the holiday. I know it's on my calendar. It starts EID. It's a 3 or 4 word phrase, and the first word is EID, and I don't remember what it is offhand. This sort of marks their transition from the Hajj to the celebration, to stone the devil. So how's that? Pretty fascinating stuff. And if you notice from this video, it says 1.8 million people in this particular year came to the Kaaba. 1.8 million people over the course of a week or so crowded in to that mosque. I don't know if this is 1.8 million all at once, but that's a lot. In this, Mecca's a pretty good sized city, but it is quite the thing. So that was where we went last week. So I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions or anything you asked last week that I forgot.
This is the Hajj has been practiced since Christ's days.
No,
2,000 years or 1,000.
Muhammad was born in the 600s, 700s. I think he died in 732.
Okay.
No, this would have been.
Okay. That's what I thought it was later.
Later. Oh, I remember one thing. There's a tradition about the stone. So supposedly the Kaaba goes back to Abraham and Ishmael.
Right.
First, this is the site. And the stone isn't quite that old. But the reason Muhammad is so connected to this is because at one point the stone somehow fell off the building. And there were several tribes in Mecca that wanted to put it back. And there was a great conflict over who would get to put the stone back in the wall. And the conflict was so great that they said the next person that walks into the mosque, that will be the person that puts it in. That will end the fighting. Guess who walks in? Muhammad walks in. And he's told, and his solution, this was before any of the revelations that would become the Quran, his solution is to get a sheet where the leaders of all the tribes hold it, put the stone in it, and carry it together to the Kaaba before it's put in. And that's a moment that, whether it's true or legend or whatever, cemented his status and propelled him forward as the one that could found this religion. So anyway.
Interesting.
Other questions, comments about that before we get into the moral code? You know that word?
Yeah.
Sharia law.
Sharia law. Yeah.
Now we're getting into some stuff, huh?
Yeah.
I bet if I were to ask, we have some very strong opinions about Sharia law. It's been in the news, around and about. It's often talked about as maybe you think about it in different countries, particularly as the Muslim population grows. The thought is they want to institute Sharia law in that place. You hear about it. There are places in Europe that as immigrants come out of the Arabic world into Europe, that becomes kind of a back of the mind threat. What is Sharia law? I'm so glad you asked. Literally, the word means the well-trodden path to water. Sounds innocent enough. And you would think in a Arabic/desert environment, a well-trodden path to water would be important. You need water. Water is vitally important. It was shortened to just meaning the true path. And it is the legal system that appears in the Muslim world that the different people go by. I already said that. There are classes of Sharia law. Now, when we think about moral law for Christians or the Old Testament, the Torah, we think thou shalt and thou shalt nots, right? There are things you do and there are things you don't do. Sharia law is interesting in that it has 5 different categories of law in it. The first one is called fard, and fard are the things that are mandatory. This is the thou shalts. In Sharia law, the fard is what you must do. If you don't, and by the way, it's individual and community. If you don't, that would be, as we would call it, sin, or that would involve some sort of punishment. The next category is mustahab. These are things that are recommended, thought to be spiritually beneficial, but are not obligatory. So how would we compare that? There is no verse in the Bible that says thou shalt read your Bible every day, right? You can't find that. You can find meditate on the law day and night and different things that show the scriptures are important. So we might put this kind of thing. It's really good practice to spend time reading the scriptures. It's beneficial for us. But to not do it isn't sin and that sort of thing. It's a benefit. So maybe this is something like that. The next category is mubah. These are permitted, neutral, indifferent. You're not going to be rewarded for doing them, but you're not going to be punished if you do them. So to think that law would have a whole category of things that, here are things that really don't matter, but we like to tell you what they are. Or they don't do good for you, they don't do bad for you. The fourth category is mukrah. How's that for a wonderful word? Mukrah? I don't know. These are things that are looked down on, maybe disliked, but they are not expressly forbidden or punished.
Like picking your nose.
Okay, that's a good one. You can pick your friends and you can pick your nose, but you can't pick your friend's nose.
I get it.
So you would look down if I picked my nose and then tried to shake your hand, say, no, thank you, sir. But I'm not going to be punished for it. You're not going to take me out and stone me.
It's not going to be remembered in an hour.
But on the other hand, these are things that to refrain from them can bring reward.
There you,
So they're not punishable, but they're potentially rewarded, which is interesting.
like
And then the
good
last,
manners and bad manners.
you could look at it that way. The last category, haram, these are the sinful, prohibited by God. These are the thou shalt nots. So we have a whole, in the Sharia law, a whole bunch of categories between what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and how they look at this sort of thing, which I find kind of interesting. And plus, it's some cool words that you could learn. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is under Sharia law, there are things called fiqh. I'm using this word. It may not be the right pronunciation. I'm going with fiqh. And these are the human interpretations of Sharia law. So one of the thoughts about Sharia law is that it is infallible and perfect, but no one knows its entirety. It's impossible to know all of Sharia law. So to fill in the blanks, humans have come along and offered their interpretations of Sharia law, which are called fiqhs. And so under these fiqhs, there are several schools of thought about Sharia law, primarily named for the cleric or the priest or the imam, depending on which branch, that came up with them. So under Sharia law, there are at least 5 schools of thought about how to interpret it. And these are named after different people. So one of them is called the Hanafi. The Hanafi is the nicest, the most liberal interpretation. About 1/3 of the Muslims that practice are here. This is a balance between reason and analogy of interpretation of Quran and Muhammad's life and teachings. So Hanafi, we would say, if you're looking at a typical continuum, would be the more liberal interpretation. If we're looking at Judaism, these would be the Reformed, that are just wide open, less strict about things, more influenced by modern times. On the other hand, the Hanbali are the most restricted. We might call these the fundamentalist interpretations of, and by the way, Hanafi was a guy, Hanbali was a guy, and so whole groups began to follow after these individuals. A third group is the Maliki. This is not from Hawaii. It sounds like, Don Ho is singing this song. The Maliki, they focus very specifically on a part of the 7th century tradition that comes closely out of Muhammad in Medina. So where Muhammad lived after he was exiled from Mecca and where he died, there's some traditions that developed around him that became the Maliki law. So we see, by the way, if you remember when we talked about the Quran came to Muhammad over many years. And it was often influenced by the particular circumstances which he found himself in. When he was in trouble, suddenly Gabriel said, "Come on up, let me give you a little insight here." And invariably those little insights addressed the situation he was in. And then he would be good for a while, and then something else would happen and Gabriel would give him a little more. And sometimes what he got here was contradictory or different to what he got there, because the situations were different and the response was different. And so these different fiqh schools are trying to take what is a very varied Quran and make sense of them. And so this one is, when he's in Medina, it's focusing on that. It's hard to say whether you would call this conservative. It's not more liberal. It would definitely be maybe not fundamentalist, definitely more conservative, and potentially a more activist situation.
Now, were these geared towards the location he was in at the time that he was dealing with each of these issues? Location he had.
These are different people that came after Muhammad.
Okay.
That are interpreting him and his writings and the Quran.
Because I'm thinking different regions have different languages and different beliefs.
Well, all of this is at about a 200 mile, Islam
It's very
starts.
tight back, yeah, that's
In
why,
Arab
that's why
world.
I'm asking, because, okay, okay.
And so this is very close to Muhammad's time and death. Now, why is Muhammad in Medina? Because when he was in Mecca and got started, he was run out of town. They were persecuted, and his best option was to leave Mecca and go someplace else. So a lot of the writings from Medina, the reason I say they're most activist is because much of what happens right after Mecca into Medina, some of those revelations that he received were very much revelations about dealing with conflict and responding to aggression, which that's what he was dealing with. And so these might be focused on those particular realities. The Shafi'i, I don't know. This is looking at those three sources, the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sunnah, and it sorts them out and says these parts and these writings are more important than these. And so it categorizes and puts a hierarchy to different teachings of Muhammad. And overall, we would say conservative here, not fundamentalist, maybe not activist, but kind of an interpretive, what do we really think we should go? If we were looking at maybe a comparable thing in Christendom, we would say the Jesus Project of a few years ago that tried to look at the Gospels and say, we think Jesus actually said these things, and we think Jesus didn't actually say these things. And so we think these things are more important because we know he said them than these things that are later tradition. Now, I don't believe that, by the way. Don't hear me say that's how I think it's in there. It's inspired. We believe it. Believe Jesus said it. But that was an approach that some critical scholars took to even the Bible. Well, this is what's happening here. They're kind of a more critical analysis of Muhammad, of the literature, and deciding through this particular cleric what they should focus on and what is less important. The last one is Jafari. Now, this is not the guy from Aladdin, the movie, if any of you are Disney fans. Jafari, this is all of the, we're going to talk about Shiite and Sunni later. These are all Sunni Muslim interpretations. Jafari is primarily the Shiite version of Sharia law. It is one that is followed in Iran. If you know much about the Iranian history and the Muslim kind of influence on Iran and groups like Hezbollah, which come out of Iran, you can see where this school of thought, this fiqh, comes into play. So we have all of these sort of things. Now, when we think about Sharia law, on the map, these aren't the only places Muslims are, but these are places where we might say they have influence. And notice this is Great Britain up here, which is, I just noticed now, I hadn't noticed that before. Although in the news the last couple of days we've seen things there. If you can't read, the green countries is where their definition is classic Sharia law, which means classic Sharia law means the Sharia law in these countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and so forth, is the law of the land. If you live in these countries, Sharia has come together with government law, and it is how you live. The red ones, they're calling classic. But the difference is the whole country isn't governed. It's just parts of the country. So I don't know my geography well enough to tell you what that country is. Leave over here, we're in the Indonesia, maybe this is Philippines. These are Muslim countries, but the whole country isn't governed by Sharia law. Certain parts of it are. And then the yellow, Sharia law only applies, India would be here, parts of China, to the Muslims. And this is also Great Britain. If it's yellow, if you're a Muslim, it's expected that you live under Sharia law. If you're not a Muslim, that might not be expected. Now, the issues that happen, for instance, even here, is a Muslim community in a non-Muslim country where you have Muslims that want to live under Sharia law, interacting regularly with non-Muslims can create conflict, especially if some non-Muslims are back up here doing the farts. Don't fart. That's bad. Oh, wait, no. This was, don't do the harams. Fards are must do, harams are not good. Sorry, all these things. So this is the reason you find conflict sometimes in these countries as these two communities. And then the blue ones, it just says mixed, which means, again, we're territorial. I think, what do we got? Is this Libya, Algeria? These are primary Muslim countries. The whole country isn't, governed by Sharia law, but there are certainly some stricter places that are. So you can see this is a pretty big swath of the
It's
world.
about a quarter of the population.
It's a big percentage of the population
If not more,
of the world.
of the population.
affected or ruled by Sharia law. Sharia law, particularly in its most conservative instances, is often looked down upon. One of the reasons that's often looked down upon is because of, we might say, I don't know if you call it strictly patriarchal or misogynistic, but women do not do so well in certain elements of Sharia law. They're not, you might think of dress, burqas and hijabs and all that. You have to be covered, and that might seem restricted, but in some places, they're not even allowed to get an education, which is bad. And then there are really odd laws around rape that definitely don't put women in a good place. So, for instance, there are places where if a woman is raped, she can be punished for premarital sex, and the person who raped her is off the hook. Or if in a place that has a stricter interpretation, a man can rape a woman, and as long as he marries her, it's not a problem anymore. Now, that's not good, right? That's not a good way to live, but this is the reality in some of these, which is why I think when we hear Sharia law, we hear those negatives, because there are these kinds of realities that are going on. In fact, there was a situation in Nigeria where a woman was thought to have been committed out of wedlock. What do you call that? Fornication, I don't know. It wasn't adultery. She was half buried in sand and was to be stoned to death. Because she had a child out of wedlock. She wasn't married and she was pregnant. But it came about that they found out it wasn't true, that she actually was married, but she'd already been buried half and had already been hit with some rocks. That's a heck of a time. I guess it's better than, when she was all the way gone. But, this is the kind of thing. And when you think about Sharia law, the other thing you think about are very harsh punishments. If you steal, what do? Cut off your hands.
Well, this is eye for an eye part of the world.
There we go.
Yeah.
You can be beheaded for blasphemy. You can be stoned for apostasy. If you commit adultery, you get 100 lashes. You can have your hand cut off for thievery and all sorts of things. When pressed about this, the response from many in the more strict countries is the burden of proof is so high that these things rarely happen, but they're meant to be a deterrent. Again, I don't live in those countries. I don't know if that's true. But all of this is the impression, I think, that's left of Sharia law. But when you think about what we just said, that might be a very small part of Sharia law, because, okay, this is a classical Sharian country. It has Sharia law, but the question is which interpretation? Is it a fundamentalist Sharian law where they're going to, execute, or is it a more liberal version of Sharia law? There's a wide swath of possibilities. And I think what we often hear, and because of certainly issues of terror and the like, not just in America, but around the world, we often lump together everything under one. And I was surprised to learn the broad spectrum of what Sharia law can be, because we're often, again, told kind of the worst case scenario, and rightly so, because if it bleeds, it leads, right? That's what we talk about.
Well, over here,
Do they play nicely together?
Who?
Obviously, your psychos And like I was watching today, the Jordanian prince, he and his wife just had a baby and they walked out of the hospital and she's dressed obviously like a normal American girl and they're holding hands and he's carrying the baby and it's but they're clearly a Muslim because he was singing Muslim prayers over his sweet new baby girl and it was precious. Do they play nicely with the psychos or do the psychos play nicely with them?
Yes and no. So how's that? What happens is, let's say you're in a Sharia. Actually, we need to go one more step because we're going to talk about worldview, and I've already hinted at it. And the moral law and worldview are going to overlap. When we talk about worldview, we have three. We're going to get rid of Sufi for a minute. Two main divisions of Muslims: the Shiite and the Sunni. So I've already kind of mentioned.
That's what we've had to deal with in this country that I've had experience. Either you're Sunni or you're Sharia. Yeah.
Not Sharia, Shiite.
Shiite, exactly.
Both of these have Sharia. Sharia is Muslim. These are sects that come up under Islam. Sunni is almost 90% of the Muslims in the world. Shiite is about 10, 12%. To give you an idea. Now, so back to your question, Denise. These two don't always play nice to each other. And if we go back to the map, sometimes, obviously 90% Sunni, right? Saudi Arabia is Sunni Muslim. Iran was Sunni Muslim under the Ayatollah. Now it's Shiite and very radically Shiite. And you don't want to be a Sunni in Iran. Syria had a civil war between Sunnis and Shias, still going on. Maybe not top of the news feed.
Sorry, I don't understand.
Neither do they. Sorry. Neither do I should say. I don't know why this thing is talking to me. So the answer is sometimes they definitely don't get along, but it has to do both with the Sunni Shia division and the interpretation of Sharia law.
Is Sunni the more progressive?
No, they're equally both progressive and fundamentalist terrorists. That was my question. I'm like, so which one of these is the bad guys? There are no bad guys that are one or the other. I wrote it down. Let me check my notes because I got to get this right. So I already mentioned Shia is in Iran. That's Hezbollah. The Sunnis are ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So,
wow. Because that's 95% of Sunnis are in the country of Jordan. But their king is clearly not cover your wife from head to toe.
Well, just because there are 4 different ways to invoke Sharia law as a Sunni. Jafari is a Shia interpretation, but back to here, these first 4 are different Sharia views that the Sunnis might have. So they may be more liberal, they may be strictly more fundamentalist, they may be a 7th century Medina kind of activist, or they may be a more conservative, but not necessarily fundamental or activist. So just because you're Sunni, you could have 4 different ways of expressing that in your day-to-day life and how law works, whereas the Shia have fewer. They primarily are Jafari. So just because you're Sunni doesn't mean you're ISIS, but ISIS is a Sunni version of a terror organization. Hezbollah is a Shia version of a terrorist organization. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question yet?
Yeah, I'm just, like I said, obviously they've been in the news because the prince just had a baby and they walked out of the hospital, looked no different than Prince William and Catherine when they walked out of the hospital. But obviously they're Muslim.
So I don't know. That would sound like the more progressive, we would say liberal, we're using that continuum version of Sharia law, which doesn't hold strictly to the jots and tittles of the Quran. Is more, we see it over time, we see how this happens and whatnot. So, but I don't know because there are options. Other questions? Have I
think you pretty much covered it, plus.
got 4 more pages.
Charles,
Yes, ma'am.
could you explain a bit about the division of Sunni and Shiite? Were they like,
Where they came from?
well, were they different descendants or something? That was my original impression, but I don't really know what I'm talking
You
about.
are somewhat right. The prime difference between these two had to do with who takes over after Muhammad died. So, Muhammad had no male heir, had no son that would take over his role. He had a daughter and a son-in-law named Ali, and he had kind of a very close compatriot. Let me get his name right. I think it's Abu Bakr. Hold on, I gotta get this right. I got my notes out of order. That's not it. I'm gonna say Abu Bakr. I'm sticking with that. Anyway, so here's how I remember it. I like this. Ali, who was his son-in-law, the Shiites, the I in Shiite, the I in Ali, they think he should be the rightful heir to Muhammad. He should be the leader of Islam as a descendant, as a direct descendant as they could have. And the Shiites to this day try to trace their leader's lineage back to Muhammad. That the only succession comes through blood. Now, ironically, because he didn't have a male heir, we have to go through his daughter, but that's how it works. Today, the guy is His Highness Aga Khan, who has an unbroken lineage back to Muhammad through Ali and his wife, who was Muhammad's daughter, Bibi Fatima. The Sunnis, Abu, Sunni, the U in Abu, the U in Sunni, Abu Bakr, they looked at this guy who at one point on a trip, Muhammad said to them, I forget the right word, but he used a word that can mean chief, advisor, or companion. That if you follow him, you should follow him because he's my Arabic word, and it had a variety of meanings. The Sunnis said what he meant was this guy should be his descendant. He should be our leader. And so we're going to follow him. And we're going to elect in the future the one who will lead us, because it doesn't have to be a descendant of Muhammad. It can be anybody that's worthy. In fact, what they called their leader is the caliph. That's where we get caliphate. I'm sure in your historical series, you've heard a lot about that. And the Shiites call their leader Imam, capital I. You may know Imam as a priest in Islam, and that is true for the Sunnis. There are many imams in Sunni, small I, like priest, but there is one imam in the Shiite tradition, and he is a descendant of Muhammad. And so the split happened way back then between the two. And so in the first several hundred years, these guys were trying to kill the descendants of Muhammad's daughter, and these guys were trying to kill the caliphs, and they fought for a long time. And at one point, they killed like a third or fourth generation down, and that really ticked them all off, and that was the last straw, and they haven't got along since. So that's where it comes from. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Dodged another one.
Yeah, because when I was in college, we had a couple guys. One was Sunni and the other was, and they stayed on separate sides of the room. And of course, I'm Methodist, we didn't understand. And then once we started talking to them, got what you went over in a little water. Yeah. But they did like each other, and they stuck to it too. That was kind of spooky, actually. Yeah, situations. But now you definitely explain it now.
So from that beginning, the Sunnis have become the dominant. I have this map. I don't know if you can see it. All of the light green are primarily Sunni, and the dark green are your Shiites, or Shias. So Iran, very Shiite. Saudi Arabia, very Sunni. And there are pockets, but you can see just from the map
And where's Israel right in there?
right here.
Right dead in the middle of it.
Wow. Right there.
The
And
one that-
holds the third holiest site of Islam,
Yeah.
is the target of many of these, ISIS. Actually, you've heard of ISIS. They have another name that's ISIL. You may have heard that name, ISIL, not ISIS, is the Islamic State. You've heard that. The Islamic State. IS in ISIS stands for Islamic State. Whether it's IS or IL. The L is Levant, which is the Levant is all of this. If you remember from our Hebrew Bible series, where this particular fertile area that Israel is part of. And so several of these terrorist organizations seem to exist to get rid of Israel. And obviously we know that, Hamas. There's Palestinian, Arabic, and Islamic terrorist organizations. There's Hezbollah from the Iranian, both Sunni and Shia. And then the other thing is these terrorist organizations also work inside these countries fighting each other. They're not just all about getting Israel, but if you're in Iran, the primary internal terrorist organization is likely Sunni, because Iran is run by Shias. If you're in Saudi Arabia, the Sunnis are in charge, so they're small, that would be Shiite, more terrorist oriented, they're more focused on trying to wrest control away from the Sunnis. Now these are, what's the word? These are potentially a minority of the Muslims that are practicing this kind of Islam that leads to terror. I was going to talk about this word, but we'll have to wait for next week. You've probably heard this word, jihad. I didn't want to do this in 3 weeks, but I think I have to. So I'm going to stop. Is that a good commercial saying that time, saying that channel will pick up there? Is that the wrong place to leave it hanging? Any questions? Anything else? Online folks?
Nope.
Nope. All quiet on the Zoom
No,
front.
we're hard to remember all this.
Yeah, well, I asked you last week how many Arabic words you wanted, and Denise said a bunch, so blame her. All right. Well, as always, I appreciate you coming along for the ride. It's very interesting.
Very interesting.
I can have a tendency to go off the deep end and do the crazy lefts and rights. So thanks for bearing with me when I do that. And I'll try my best. If you have any questions, to answer those as we go along, even if I have to do homework. I don't have any homework this week.
And then
so
you
that's
don't,
good.
you're free.
I'm good so far. So let's pray and then we'll
Since he started.
be dismissed. That's one of the few times.
Yeah.
Father in heaven, we thank you for the grace of your Son, Jesus Christ. We thank you that we, because of him, know you and are known by you, that we have forgiveness, that we have salvation. And Lord, as we look into these other faiths, even though we've done just a couple, Lord, it's a reminder to me of what a beautiful thing is your grace and mercy is to us, that we are free. We are no longer under law, but under grace. And I thank you for that reality, because I know my own sinful heart, my own sinful self. And I'm grateful that we can open your word and hear that where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And so thank you that we live in that reality. Father, help us to have, through this study, to grow compassion for these other faiths. Some we might have interaction with, some we may not ever have any opportunity to know a person. Personally, I've never known personally a Muslim. I might have met one or two here, but never had a relationship. But Father, if we ever do, may we, through these things we learn, grow compassion for them that would lead us to explain to them the grace that we know of our God and of how you've revealed yourself. Father, bless us as we leave tonight, as we go to our homes, as we enter the rest of this week with the things that we hope for and the things that we're not expecting. Father, may we know your guidance and your provision each step of the way. Asking in Jesus' name. Amen.